Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. East Pennsboro Township, Pennsylvania. Friday, January 10th, 2003. Porch lights glowed over Wood Street as neighbors settled into their weekend routines. At approximately 8:45 p.m., Randy Lee Trimble, 28 years old, a respected speech-language pathologist, returned home after her day. Within minutes, that quiet residential block absorbed a crime that would alter it permanently. Randy was known among colleagues as professional, steady, and dedicated to her patients. Friends described her as kind and unassuming, someone who found fulfillment in her work and community. On that January night, she followed her usual pattern, pulling into the garage, shutting the door behind her. According to contemporaneous police reports, the timeline between her arrival and the violent attack was so narrow that investigators would later call it one of the tightest windows they had ever worked with. The first formal response began when a neighbor, noticing abnormal noises and lights left on past routine, contacted 911. Dispatch logged the call shortly before 9 o'clock p.m. Patrol units arrived within minutes, securing the perimeter of the Wood Street residence. Officers documented quiet anomalies. The victim's vehicle parked slightly off its normal axis inside the garage, the absence of any obvious forced entry at doors or windows and drawers inside, disturbed in a way that did not fit typical burglary patterns. Emergency medical personnel entered under police escort. They confirmed a violent assault. The victim, Randy, was pronounced deceased at the scene. Time of death was preliminarily set around the attack window, based on body temperature and immediate condition. The house was sealed as a potential primary crime scene. Officers initiated a basic canvass of neighbors, recording initial impressions of sounds, lights, and unusual traffic. From the outset, investigators noted several negative evidence points. Randy's phone showed no outgoing calls or text attempts during the critical minutes of her arrival. Neighbors reported no loud struggle or breaking glass during the relevant 20-minute period, a detail that would complicate early theories of a random break-in. In addition, valuables remained untouched. Purses, electronics, and cash were still inside. What appeared staged was not convincing, and this disconnect began to push the investigation away from opportunistic burglary toward something more targeted. By late that night, East Pennsboro Township Police, in coordination with Cumberland County detectives, documented the residence with photographs, sketches, and logs. Every entry and exit point was recorded, with forensic technicians marking potential trace evidence zones. A scene command log was opened, establishing chain of custody from that first hour forward. The timeline locked quickly. Arrival around 8:45 p.m., attack within minutes, 911 call before 9 o'clock p.m., patrol units on site by 9:10 p.m. These anchors became the backbone of the entire investigation. The rapidity of the sequence meant that whoever was responsible either had precise knowledge of Randy's schedule or was already in position, waiting for her return. That question, planned ambush or chance encounter, would drive every subsequent lead. By the close of the first night, the case had shifted from response to full homicide investigation. Detectives faced an unsettling puzzle. A victim attacked in her own home with no clear sign of forced entry, a timeline that left no margin for error, and a community where neighbors saw nothing unusual. The lack of obvious theft, combined with the tightly controlled window of opportunity, suggested this was not a random act of violence. As one investigator remarked later in court filings, if you looked only at the clock, you saw intent. Nobody stumbles into a crime that precise. From the clock on Wood Street, the case moves to a table where evidence speaks in measurements, not opinions. The transfer from the residence to the county morgue is documented, line by line, time of release from scene command, names and badge numbers for the two officers who signed the body over to the transport team, evidence seals applied to personal items collected at the house, and a receipt confirming destination and arrival. The point is simple and not dramatic. Chain of custody must be airtight. A single gap can sink a homicide case, and everyone in the room knows it. Intake begins the same way every time. The decedent is assigned a case number, identifying features are photographed, clothing is inventoried, paper bagged to prevent condensation, and labeled. Fingernails are clipped into sterile envelopes, hair control samples are taken, oral, vaginal, and rectal swabs are collected where policy requires. Each package gets a unique identifier that will track through testing, reporting, and, if needed, trial. The medical examiner dictates a short summary to establish context. A woman in her late 20s, pronounced at a residence in East Pennsboro Township, Pennsylvania, with injuries consistent with sharp force trauma and ligature assault. The discovery circumstances have already been logged by police. Here, they're reduced to a clause and set aside. The morgue treats the body itself as the primary scene. External examination proceeds under constant photography. The team notes a patterned groove consistent with ligature compression around the neck. This will later be compared to any cord or cable seized. There are multiple sharp force injuries to the torso and extremities, consistent with what investigators were told at the scene. The count is high and will be finalized after internal inspection. Wound edges are measured, their orientation mapped, and the presence or absence of hilt marks recorded. Tool mark specialists may later review photographs to suggest blade class, but the morgue confines itself to morphology and directionality. Any defensive artifact, abrasions on palms, radial slices on forearms, must be described exactly as observed, without inferring motive or struggle. When language matters, the examiner chooses compatible with rather than caused by. It keeps the record clean. Internal examination confirms the external story. There are hemorrhages in the strap muscles of the neck that align with compression during life, not post-mortem artifact. The laryngeal structures are checked for fractures. Petechiae are documented if present. The sharp force track paths are opened and followed to a terminus, with damage to underlying organs noted by anatomical location and depth. Collectively, the injuries explain death by combined ligature strangulation and multiple stab wounds. The exact phrasing will be set in the formal report after microscopic review and toxicology. The manner of death is homicide. Toxicology collection is routine but critical. Femoral blood, vitreous humor, urine, and, where available, liver tissue are sent for screening. Even if the decedent was not suspected of impairment, a clean tox panel removes points of speculation later. In homicide work, silence in the data can be as useful as a positive hit. That's the working theme of this case already. When nothing obvious speaks, negatives begin to define the edges. Trace processing happens in parallel. The clothing is examined over clean paper to capture any loose fibers or particulates. If a suspected cord is recovered elsewhere with trace on it, the lab will compare fiber type, dye profile, and microscopic features. Swabs from the neck and wound margins are preserved for DNA. Blood standards collected during autopsy will serve as references. If foreign DNA is recovered, the question becomes where it sits, surface transfer versus embedded, and how it maps to the injury pattern. The morgue creates that map. Investigators will later decide what it means. Documentation extends beyond photos. The examiner's dictation logs temperature, lividity, and rigor at intake, and notes are cross-referenced with the time anchors established at the residence. Estimating a narrow time of death window is less about guesswork than it is about consistency. The house temperature, the decedent's clothing, reported arrival within minutes, and the time EMS pronounced are stacked to minimize spread. The aim is to preserve the tight timeline that already gives the case shape. One item the team refuses to do is read motive into wounds. Anatomy tells you what happened. It rarely tells you why. The insurance talk, the relationship questions, the who benefits line. Those belong to detectives and prosecutors. The morgue's lane is to define the mechanism, fix the manner, preserve the trace, and protect the chain. Before zipping the body bag for transfer to refrigeration, technicians recheck labels, count evidence envelopes, and verify every seal. The property log is signed again. If a cord or cable was recovered at the residence, it will be compared later for length, flexibility, diameter, and the ability to reproduce the neck groove pattern under controlled conditions. If a knife is seized, the lab will evaluate whether its width and tip geometry are compatible with wound tracks. Match is not used lightly in modern forensic reporting. Compatibility is the accurate term unless microscopic striations or unique tool marks allow a stronger conclusion. The preliminary autopsy summary goes out the same day. Adult female, homicidal violence, ligature strangulation with multiple sharp force injuries, samples retained for DNA and toxicology, additional microscopic analysis pending. The language is intentionally spare. Cases collapse when reports wander. There is a moment most teams allow themselves, and it isn't sentimental. They note her by name, Randy Lee Trimble, and confirm again that each step they just performed protects a person and a prosecution. In towns like this, crime isn't an abstraction. It's a chain of decisions that either preserves the truth or lets it bleed away. The clinicians are not there to speculate. They are there to leave no room for error. To move the case forward, the scene at Wood Street must now be processed with the same discipline the morgue applied to the body. From the morgue's findings, investigators returned to Wood Street to treat the house and garage as controlled environments. Technicians entered under a new log, confirming each step to preserve chain of custody. Wide-angle photographs locked the garage and residence in place before anything was moved. The victim's car was slightly off its usual axis. The driver's seat track and dome light were measured. Partial prints were lifted from handles and sealed as working evidence. Nothing on doors or windows suggested forced entry, a detail already considered a negative indicator. Inside, drawers appeared disturbed, but valuables were untouched. Photos captured each drawer's position. The lack of prints on certain surfaces became part of the record. Staging without handling can be as telling as recovered latents. Floor mats from the vehicle yielded light fibers inconsistent with the carpet color. Swabs were taken from steering wheel and gear shift for potential touch DNA. Technicians also bagged a garage door remote and dusted the wall button. Even smudges or pressure arcs could support later testimony. Lighting and switch states were documented. Warm bulbs in some rooms, timers in others, created a silent map of movement through the house. Neighbors confirmed normal patterns. Deviations would later test alibis. Cords and knives were inventoried. If a knife block showed a missing slot, that was photographed. If cables matched the diameter of the ligature groove noted at autopsy, they were seized. Each was labeled working until compatibility testing could be done. Parallel canvassing reached nearby businesses. In early 2003, limited CCTV was still available. Investigators pulled any surviving tapes from intersections to check traffic during the attack window. Even the absence of expected vehicles could matter. Sometimes silence in the data was its own clue. By the end of the pass, the physical picture was consistent. A fast assault within minutes of arrival, no forced entry, items left behind, and a garage that showed subtle anomalies rather than chaos. Precision, not randomness, defined the scene. With the property sealed again, attention shifted to phone logs and early 2000s digital traces to verify movements and challenge statements. From itemized trace, we moved to signals and paperwork, calls, sectors, and money that either support an alibi or take it off the board. Carrier records arrive in blocks, originating and terminating numbers, timestamps down to the minute, call duration, and the serving cell site sector when available for each hit. Investigators chart the evening of Friday, January 10, 2003 across a simple grid, left to right by time, top to bottom by device, and overlay the within minutes attack window established on Wood Street. The first finding is negative and important. The victim's phone shows no outgoing activity during that narrow span. That silence aligns with what patrol documented and what the morgue's timing supports. It does not prove where she was, but it brackets what she was not doing, reaching out for help, calling ahead, or answering anyone after pulling into the garage. Alibi statements are tested against the grid. If a person claims to have been stationary, the pattern typically shows a small number of sectors repeating in sequence. If movement occurred, sector IDs step outward in a logical path along known roads. In Cumberland County in 2003, sectorization is coarse compared to later years, but it is still good enough to challenge impossibilities. Investigators map sectors to the approach and egress routes around Wood Street, mark a 5 to 10 minute travel radius, and ask one question. Could any named person have been at the residence within minutes of the established time and still show the activity they reported? Where the answer is no, a statement is scheduled for re-interview. Where the answer is maybe, the team looks for corroboration outside the grid. Two patterns draw attention. First, a device in the inner circle shows brief clustered calls earlier in the evening and then an abrupt dark interval bracketing the attack window. No incoming or outgoing activity for a stretch when this user typically shows sporadic traffic. In 2003, silence may indicate the phone was off, battery removed, or simply left elsewhere. Second, another associated number pings sectors that are compatible with a short drive to and from the Wood Street corridor, then goes quiet. Neither pattern is proof of presence, but both are working leads that justify closer scrutiny of statements about location and timing. Investigators sanity check the grid with travel time tests. Using the same approach roads later checked for CCTV, A detective drives the route at the same hour to estimate how long it would take to depart one mentioned location and reach the residence, then depart again. Even under conservative assumptions, the drive test suggests the window is tight but feasible for someone who knows exactly when the garage door will close. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. When a sequence fits a narrow window too well, it can indicate planning rather than coincidence. The next layer is computer forensics, triggered by the seizure logged January 11, 2003. In early 2000s workflows, analysts image the hard drive, preserve a cryptographic hash, and work from the image to avoid altering the original. They pull browser history, recent documents, email fragments, and, where available, temporary internet files. The search terms themselves matter less than the pattern they create over days or weeks. According to contemporaneous media and investigative summaries, artifacts consistent with planning and communication appear in the days leading up to the homicide. References to attack methods, timing at home arrival, and contacts between two men within the victim's orbit. Each item is marked working until cross-validated by statements or independent records. The file timestamps are checked against system time to discourage claims of accidental clicks or post-event contamination. Email analysis in that era is basic but useful. Header data, send, receive times, and routing all survive well enough to establish sequences. Where content exists in unallocated space, recovered fragments are presented cautiously, as partial views only. If a message references the victim's routine or lists best times, that becomes critical when aligned to the within minutes attack window. If any message implies payment, that becomes a bridge to the next section of this chapter. Insurance records are requested through lawful process. Investigators confirm a $100,000 life insurance policy with beneficiary information and effective dates. This is not motive by itself. People carry insurance every day, but when mapped to debt, unusual spending, or cash needs tied to a side project, the policy becomes part of financial context. Bank statements for relevant accounts are reviewed for withdrawals, transfers, or purchases of equipment that could align with what the morgue and scene suggest. A few transactions stand out, not because of their size, but because of their timing. Purchases of cordage, utility knives, or equipment that match general descriptions can be wholly innocent. Only when dates stack close to the homicide and communications tie the same individuals together do they gain weight. At this stage, every item is logged as working. It remains working until a lab report or a statement confirms it. Phone billing anomalies get their own pass. Pre- and post-event call frequencies are compared to a baseline month to detect suppression behavior, a user who suddenly reduces activity only around a critical window. Analysts also look for duo patterns, two numbers that frequently exchange calls, then stop abruptly right before a major event, resuming only after. That exact behavior can reflect nothing, or it can reflect in-person contact planned to avoid records. When seen alongside a dark interval around the homicide, it becomes a priority for interviews. Investigators pull the subscriber records behind several auxiliary numbers that appeared in proximity to the inner circle. A prepaid phone is noted. In 2003, burners are cruder than in later years, but registration data, purchase locations, and top-up receipts can still supply leverage. If a prepaid device surfaces with overlapping sectors near Wood Street at the relevant time, it is flagged for deeper examination and compared against any surveillance tapes recovered from convenience stores that sell calling cards or handsets. Again, none of this is decisive alone. The strength comes from convergence. Sectors, billing patterns, computer artifacts, and purchases pointing to the same limited group. The running question for viewers is straightforward. When statements do not account for device silence and purchases track too close to the event, at what point does probability become persuasion? The law does not require certainty from every piece, only a fair reading that, taken together, the data rises above coincidence. In this investigation, the momentum shifts here. Alibis that once looked durable now have seams. Before closing the digital phase, the team cross-references switch state mapping from the house with claim times and interviews. A person who says they entered the kitchen after the event will need to explain why a particular switch was off when they insist they turned it on. A person who says they never entered a room will need to explain latent recovery or DNA transfer. This is why Chapter 3's restraint matters. By avoiding big claims then, the record now supports small, targeted contradictions without needing to restage the scene. Financial review ends with a simple ledger. Insurance posture confirmed, debts or obligations noted, any cash movement close to the date circled, any equipment that could serve as a ligature or blade listed as working until the lab speaks. The digital review ends with a similar ledger. Devices exhibiting dark intervals, sectors compatible with short drives to and from Wood Street, communications that prefigure timing, and any prepaid activity overlapping the window. None of it is dramatic. All of it is incremental. The power of crime reconstruction often sits in patterns that are hard to explain away. With signals and money aligned, the next push is human. Interviews and statement analysis pressed against what the records now say and do not say. From signals and money, we move to voices that either withstand the record or bend under it. Detectives start closest to Randy Lee Trimble and work outward. The first interviews establish routine. Friday schedule, expected arrival, the habit of entering through the garage and closing it before bringing in her bag. Those who knew her well confirmed the pattern without prompting. That detail matters because the call grid from January 10, 2003 already anchors a narrow window, within minutes of arrival, and because knowing the habit makes timing an opportunity rather than guesswork. A spouse is always interviewed early, not because of presumption, but because proximity demands it. The conversation is recorded with counsel availability noted. Basic anchors are placed on tape, where the spouse claims to have been, who they spoke with, and when. Investigators ask for specifics, start and stop times, television programs, receipts, and any calls made or received. In a later pass, the team overlays those statements on call detail records and cell site sectors. Where the narrative claims movement or conversation, the devices should show it. Where the narrative claims stillness, sectors should remain stable. In this file, an alibi that sounded solid at first brushes up against the same dark interval flagged in Chapter 4. The device attributed to that narrator goes silent before the attack window and reappears after. Silence is not guilt. It is a discrepancy that needs resolution. Friends and coworkers supply a different kind of data. They confirm Randy's professionalism and her predictable end-of-week cadence. Several note a second figure around her orbit, someone aligned through a side indie film project and friendly with the spouse. The mention is neutral in tone, but consistent in content. When asked about communications, one witness recalls texts being uncommon in 2003 and points investigators to calls and email. That matches the technology limits already in play. The point is not style, it is timeline. Contacts among that small group increase in the days before the homicide, then drop near the critical minutes on Friday night. After they resume in patterns that feel routine again, investigators label it working behavior and move to corroborate. A careful interview technique avoids leading questions. Detectives begin with open prompts. Walk me through your Friday from late afternoon to bedtime, and only later introduce contradictions from the record. In one re-interview, a subject who previously described an uninterrupted evening now remembers a short errand. Drive tests and sector maps say that errand, if real, could intersect Wood Street. The subject is asked for corroboration, a receipt, a witness, a timestamp. None appear. Without raising voice or accusation, the detective gently resets the anchor. Help me understand where your phone was when it wasn't registering activity. There are legitimate answers, battery failure, device left at home, but any answer will need external support. Neighbors contribute small but additive details. A porch light that usually goes off earlier stayed on longer later that night. A car that typically idles in one driveway did not. No one reports hearing a fight, a fact already captured as negative evidence in Chapter 1. That absence tightens the picture of a swift, controlled contact inside the garage. When a later interview suggests a loud confrontation, the statement does not match what neighbors recall. It is flagged, not as a lie, but as an inconsistency that erodes confidence in the narrator. The morgue's conclusions also shape questioning. Because autopsy findings support ligature compression in addition to multiple sharp force injuries, detectives ask whether any cords, cables, or straps in the residence were recently moved or replaced. A subject deflects, saying they have no idea. Yet earlier, the same person volunteered a comment about tidying the garage. The contradiction is small and avoidable, but it sits on tape. In a case where the assault occurs within minutes, minor slips matter because they imply foreknowledge or post-event staging. Email fragments recovered after the January 11, 2003 seizure become interview exhibits. Investigators do not show everything at once. They present a neutral message about schedule, note that the time mentioned is consistent with Randy's arrival, and ask who else saw it. They present a fragment listing best times, then ask why that language was used. The response is often to downplay, just chatter, casual talk, nothing real. The detective allows the answer to sit before placing a second exhibit, a call log where two numbers communicate frequently in the week leading up to the homicide. Pause around the attack window, then resume the following day. Coincidence is an option. It is no longer the only option. Insurance is addressed last because juries hear it as motive and interviews must keep the tone clinical. Investigators confirm knowledge of a $100,000 policy, beneficiary designation, and whether any conversation about money occurred in the weeks prior. People have policies for many reasons. In isolation, a policy means nothing. In concert with device silence, sector paths compatible with short drives to and from the residence, and references to timing at home arrival, it becomes part of a pattern the law cares about: planning and benefit. Small corroborations are gathered to validate or challenge each person's account. A claimed phone call is checked for existence and duration. A supposed drive is measured against typical traffic. A timeline that originally floated within an hour is narrowed to specific minutes because the grid in Chapter 4 already did the same. The process is patient, not theatrical. The line that investigators repeat to themselves is simple: statements are evidence until the records disagree. By the close of this round, a hierarchy of reliability emerges. Witnesses who spoke in specifics remain durable. Witnesses who relied on impressions now face objective anchors that disagree. One subject, tied by friendship to the spouse and by references to the indie film, will not break under questioning but cannot reconcile the pauses in communication or the travel compatible with Wood Street. The interview remains professional. The pressure is documentary, not emotional. In towns like this, crime is not solved by hunches. It is solved by aligning what people say with what devices and receipts allow. When those lines converge, the next steps become appropriate: search warrants targeting items already flagged as working, and legal decisions about how to present a charging theory with integrity. With statements tested against signals and money, the investigation turns to procurement and planning, receipts, purchases, and surveillance that connect intent to capability. From interviews and digital gaps, investigators pivot toward tangible evidence: what was bought, when, and why. Bank records and retail subpoenas return quickly. Receipts from Cumberland County stores show purchases of cord, gloves, and a utility knife in the days leading up to January 10, 2003. On their own, ordinary items. When clustered against the homicide timeline, they stand out. Surveillance tapes from those stores, though grainy, confirm a lone figure selecting the items and paying cash. Call sector data from the same minutes place a known device nearby, reinforcing the chain. Computer forensics imaged on January 11th add weight. Cache fragments reveal searches on door access and household routines alongside a text file noting store addresses and hours. None are direct instructions, but they map onto the purchases. Insurance paperwork confirms a $100,000 policy, already documented in prior chapters, which frames motive when layered with spending tied to a side film project. Investigators also log a boot receipt and an employee's note about quiet tread. No direct match yet, but the detail is preserved in case outsole analysis connects later. Fuel transactions near approach roads, timed to the critical Friday, suggest travel prep. Together, these records build the portrait of preparation: cash spent, tools gathered, timing aligned with Randy's last evening alive. By closing, procurement evidence shifts from circumstantial to actionable. The next logical step is to apply these items in charging theory and interagency coordination, weighing which strands clear probable cause. With procurement evidence secured, investigators move to translate facts into charges a court would accept. Prosecutors in Cumberland County focused on three primary counts: first-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, and criminal solicitation. The affidavit outlined Randy Trimble's final timeline: the clustered purchases of cord and a knife, call detail records showing abrupt pauses during the attack window, and the $100,000 insurance policy naming Brian Trimble as beneficiary. Each item was anchored to certified records and lab submissions, avoiding speculation. Interagency work was methodical. East Pennsboro Police maintained command, the State Police Lab handled tool and court analysis, carriers certified call logs, and the DA's office prepared the charging package. Search warrants targeted homes and vehicles. Recovered cord and knife packaging were submitted for compatibility testing. One suspect requested counsel and entered a proffer, later corroborated by independent evidence. This admission, along with procurement receipts and digital records, solidified the conspiracy theory. Brian Trimble as planner and financier, Blaine Norris as the actor. Both were charged under accomplice liability. Bail was denied, and prosecutors opted against capital punishment, securing life without parole as the most certain outcome. The case then shifted toward pretrial motions, where the scope of admissible evidence would be contested. With motions decided, the case shifted from investigation to permanent judgment. Pretrial hearings settled key points. Cell site records were ruled admissible as business records with limits on precision. Store receipts, surveillance video, and autopsy compatibilities were likewise admitted. Suppression motions failed. Bail remained denied. According to court filings, Blaine Norris pled guilty on April 19, 2004 to first-degree murder and received life without parole. On May 6, 2004, Brian Trimble entered his plea to first-degree murder and also received life without parole in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. At sentencing, Randy Lee Trimble's family gave victim impact statements, underscoring the loss of a 28-year-old whose life was cut short in her own garage. The judge noted the calculated planning and imposed mandatory life terms. In later years, her family turned grief into advocacy, supporting programs for survivors of domestic violence. This resolution highlights how layered evidence, call logs, receipts, surveillance, autopsy findings, and corroborated admissions builds a coherent path to accountability. No parole hearings remain. The outcome is final. Guilty. Sentenced to life without parole. As I close this story, I can't help but think about how quickly trust can be broken and how devastating the consequences of betrayal can be. Randy Trimble's murder reminds us that real safety isn't just about locks on our doors. It's about the choices we make in relationships and the courage to recognize danger when it hides in plain sight. For me, telling this crime story is not only about the facts, but also about the lesson. Value your life, your independence, and never ignore the quiet warning signs. I'd love to hear your perspective. Do you think life without parole truly delivers justice, or does it leave unanswered questions for families? Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. If this video resonated with you, or even if you disagreed, tell me why. And if you want more stories that go deep into the crimes that shake communities and the lessons they leave behind, please hit subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next.